In the far reaches of northeastern France, near the edges of the Vosges Mountains, lies the village of Domrémy. To the modern eye, it appears almost untouched by time. Modest homes of timber and wattle, fields stretching in orderly rows, and a winding river reflecting the shifting light of the sun as it rises and falls over the gentle landscape. In the early years of the 15th century, Domrémy was quieter still. Life here was slow and predictable, marked by the cadence of the seasons, the rhythm of planting and harvesting, and the small but important rituals that structured every day. The village's population numbered in the hundreds, a tight-knit community where everyone knew each other's lineage, trade, and temperament. It was here, in this seemingly unremarkable place, that a girl named Joan d'Arc, later known to the world as Joan of Arc, spent the earliest chapters of her life. Joan was born around 1412, the daughter of Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romay, two peasants who managed to carve out a modest but stable life in Domrémy. Her father, Jacques, was a farmer and a minor landowner, responsible for tending his fields, overseeing a small herd of animals, and occasionally serving in local militia duties when the threat of English raids or marauding bands arose. Isabelle, her mother, managed the household, preparing meals, tending a kitchen garden, and supervising the weaving, spinning, and sewing that formed the backbone of domestic life. Life in Domrémy revolved around work, discipline, and a strong sense of community responsibility. Children were expected to contribute from a very young age, and Joan's days would have been filled with both chores and instruction, though the education available was limited and practical rather than literary. In those days, education for girls in rural villages, like Domrémy, rarely extended beyond basic literacy and religious instruction. Joan likely learned to read from the family Bible or from the psalters and prayer books that Isabelle carefully maintained. Her mother would have recited prayers aloud in the morning and evening, and the rhythm of church bells punctuated the passing days. These sounds, steady, almost meditative, formed the backdrop of her early childhood. In these quiet, repetitive moments, Joan absorbed not only the content of her faith, but also the unspoken values of her community: devotion, diligence, and an acute awareness of the precariousness of life in a world beset by war and uncertainty. The historical context of Joan's childhood is important, though it would have seemed distant and abstract to a young girl. France was in turmoil, torn apart by the 100 Years' War, which had been ongoing, intermittently, since 1337. The kingdom was fractured, its authority contested, its people beleaguered by successive generations of conflict. The northern regions, including much of Domrémy's surrounding areas, were especially vulnerable to raids and territorial skirmishes. Villagers maintained a careful watch over their fields and homes, wary of soldiers who might pass through demanding food or taxes. These external pressures added a quiet tension to daily life, a sense that stability was fragile and must be nurtured with vigilance. Despite these looming threats, Domrémy offered a semblance of safety and continuity. The village was surrounded by small forests and pastures, and its residents were skilled at making do with limited resources. Corn, wheat, and rye were staples, often ground at local mills and baked into bread that sustained families through long winters. Cattle and goats provided milk, cheese, and occasional meat. Seasonal festivals and church holidays punctuated the calendar, offering moments of celebration and respite when the monotony of work was momentarily lifted. For a child like Joan, these festivals would have been occasions for observing social rituals. The parades, the feasts, the communal prayers, and the simple pleasure of gathering with neighbors. These seemingly mundane experiences imprinted upon her a sense of community, hierarchy, and tradition that would later shape her understanding of society and leadership. Joan's personality, as described in later testimonies, suggests that even as a child, she was introspective and unusually attentive to spiritual matters. While other children might have played in the fields or followed the routines of farm labor without question, Joan reportedly spent hours in quiet contemplation, listening to the voices she would later describe as saints and angels. Historians note that her family, deeply devout themselves, did not discourage her piety, though it must have seemed unusual even in a culture steeped in faith. The combination of her quiet upbringing, the structured rhythm of rural life, and the constant awareness of a war-torn world created a fertile environment for the extraordinary visions that would come to define her adolescence. The daily schedule of a child in Domrémy was a careful balance between work, observation, and participation in community life. Morning began before dawn, often with prayer and a simple breakfast of bread and milk. Fields had to be tended, animals fed, and firewood gathered. Tasks were repeated in cycles, dictated by the seasons: sowing in the spring, harvesting in the summer, preparing food stores in the autumn, and surviving the cold, dark winters with careful rationing. These repetitive tasks may seem unremarkable, but they cultivated qualities in Joan that later historians point to as foundational for her resilience: patience, diligence, and a keen eye for detail. To survive in this world, one could not afford carelessness. Even the most ordinary moments of childhood contained lessons in observation and adaptation. Walking to the river to collect water, tending the goats, or assisting her mother in preparing meals required attentiveness to weather patterns, the behavior of animals, and the changing landscape. Children like Joan were keenly aware of cause and effect, of the slow unfolding of time, and of the consequences of human actions. Such observations, seemingly trivial, honed the faculties that would later allow her to navigate complex military and political scenarios with surprising clarity for someone so young. In addition to domestic labor, Joan would have participated in local social life, which was itself a slow, deliberate affair. Weddings, baptisms, funerals, and church festivals were punctuated by ritual and repetition. These events reinforced social hierarchies and community cohesion. Joan observed, perhaps without fully articulating it at the time, the ways people organized themselves, resolved disputes, and responded to authority. These quiet lessons in social dynamics, learned in the fields and churches of Domrémy, were as critical to her formation as the more overtly spiritual experiences she would later recount. The natural environment surrounding Domrémy also played a subtle role in shaping Joan's consciousness. Forests, rivers, and meadows provided both resources and solitude. Seasonal changes were keenly felt. The chill of early winter, the rush of spring thaw, the long, hot days of summer. Villagers were intimately attuned to these cycles because their survival depended upon them. Joan, like other children of her village, learned to read the world in these slow, incremental changes. The interplay of light, temperature, and the movement of animals informed her understanding of temporality, cause, and adaptation lessons that would later translate into an almost preternatural sense of timing and situational awareness in her military campaigns. Yet even in such a tightly regimented life, moments of unpredictability existed. The arrival of strangers, the sudden rumors of enemy movements, or the effects of illness could disrupt the steady rhythm of the village. Joan would have witnessed, even in her early years, the fragility of human plans and the inevitability of uncertainty. These early experiences may have laid the groundwork for the courage and composure she displayed when confronted with danger later in life. In the midst of routine, she learned to navigate the unexpected, a skill that would prove invaluable. By the time she reached early adolescence, Joan's reputation in Domrémy as a thoughtful, devout, and somewhat mysterious child had begun to take shape. Neighbors recalled her attentiveness to prayers, her earnestness in performing chores, and the peculiar intensity with which she sometimes regarded the world around her. Her spiritual visions, which she would later recount in meticulous detail during interrogations and trials, likely began in these years, appearing as intermittent, quiet disturbances in her otherwise ordered life. While the villagers might have considered these experiences odd, they would have seemed plausible within a culture deeply attuned to the presence of the divine in daily life. The environment of Domrémy, with its combination of mundane labor, community structure, and the ever-present backdrop of war, created the foundation upon which Joan's extraordinary life would be built. She was, at once, a product of her time and place, and a figure whose future actions would transcend the ordinary constraints of her upbringing. Her childhood, filled with routine and repetition, with small victories and measured observations, prepared her for the moment when the extraordinary would break through the ordinary. And yet, even with all these preparations, one question remained, even in the quiet, sleepy village of Domrémy. What exactly would these visions and early experiences compel her to do when the wider, chaotic world of France demanded more than mere observation? By the time Joan d'Arc reached her early teens, the quiet village rhythms of Domrémy were increasingly punctuated by an inner life that would come to define her. While most of her days remained filled with chores, tending animals, and assisting her mother in the preparation of food, she began to experience something that set her apart from her peers. Visions. These were not sudden, spectacular apparitions designed for shock or awe. Rather, they were subtle, persistent, and often deeply private experiences that quietly demanded her attention. For a girl in early 15th century France, steeped in religious practice and biblical literacy, such occurrences were both understandable and profoundly disorienting. Joan described hearing voices, which she would later attribute to saints such as Michael, Catherine, and Margaret. These voices were instructive, cautionary, and at times urgent, guiding her attention toward matters of faith and, eventually, matters of national significance. In a world where divine intervention was a credible explanation for the unexpected or miraculous, Joan's experiences would have been interpreted differently than they might be today. Yet even within her deeply religious household, the intensity and insistence of these voices were remarkable. Isabel, her mother, likely encouraged devotion while also teaching restraint, understanding that the community could respond harshly to claims of visions or direct contact with the divine. The content of Joan's spiritual experiences was grounded in familiar religious frameworks. She learned the lives of saints, the stories of biblical heroes, and the principles of morality that structured every parish sermon. When voices or visions occurred, they were filtered through these teachings. For Joan, the saints were not distant figures in gilded manuscripts. They were interlocutors, guides, and occasional critics. Historical records, particularly the transcripts from her later trial, suggest that her visions were not accompanied by elaborate displays of miracles, fire, or radiant light, but by simple commands and gentle urgencies, requests for her to act in ways that seemed, at the time, both impossible and inevitable. It is important to consider the psychological and social context of these experiences. Adolescence in medieval Europe was both a period of physical maturation and social conditioning. Girls were expected to move from domestic apprenticeship to eventual marriage or service, learning patience, piety, and submission to societal hierarchies. In this environment, the emergence of persistent visions could be interpreted as a spiritual calling, a heightened moral sensitivity, or if misunderstood, a source of concern. Joan navigated these experiences privately at first, weighing the voice's instructions against the expectations of her family and neighbors. The fact that she continued her daily routines, tending animals, and maintaining household responsibilities, underscores a remarkable ability to integrate the extraordinary into the ordinary. The specific historical moment of Joan's adolescence cannot be overstated. France was fractured, politically unstable, and militarily vulnerable. The English controlled large portions of northern France, and internal divisions among French nobles weakened the crown's authority. Rumors of betrayal, local skirmishes, and the slow advance of foreign armies created a pervasive sense of unease. For a young girl who was sensitive to both spiritual and worldly concerns, this environment could transform ordinary fears into moral imperatives. Joan's visions, calling her to intervene in matters of national significance, were thus intertwined with the very real dangers and instability of her surroundings. The first recorded indications of Joan's spiritual activism occurred around the age of 13. She reportedly confided in close family members about her voices, expressing both trepidation and determination. Her initial reluctance to share these experiences widely suggests a nuanced awareness of social perception. In a small village like Domrémy, claims of divine communication could be met with reverence, skepticism, or suspicion. Joan's careful disclosure to trusted family members indicates that she was learning early to navigate the delicate balance between personal conviction and communal expectation, a skill that would prove essential in her later dealings with local officials, nobles, and eventually, kings. Interestingly, Joan's experiences were not continuous or constant. She described periods of silence when the voices withdrew, leaving her to resume the routines of village life. These intervals of normalcy may have served as periods of reflection, allowing her to interpret previous instructions, observe the unfolding realities of her environment, and prepare for the next series of messages. Historical accounts suggest that she treated these intervals with patience and reflection, rather than frustration or despair. Such measured responses speak to an extraordinary degree of self-discipline, particularly for someone of her age and social position. The moral and spiritual dimension of Joan's visions also reinforced the virtues that her family and community prized. The saints instructed her to live virtuously, to avoid sin, and to cultivate courage in the face of fear. In the mundane context of daily chores, attending Mass, and assisting in domestic tasks, these directives may have seemed trivial, yet they cultivated a sense of inner purpose and fortitude. Joan's family reportedly supported these practices, noting that her piety, while intense, aligned with the religious expectations of the community. Even so, the idea that a young peasant girl could play a decisive role in matters beyond the village would have been unimaginable at the time. The local environment also contributed to her contemplative experiences. The forests, fields, and rivers around Domrémy provided spaces for solitude, reflection, and quiet observation. Walking alone through meadows or tending small gardens, Joan would have been immersed in the rhythms of nature, the slow unfolding of seasonal change, the movements of animals, and the passage of light and shadow across the landscape. Such settings were conducive to introspection, enabling her to internalize the guidance she believed she received, and to imagine ways in which she might act upon it. This blending of spiritual attentiveness and environmental observation became a hallmark of her later strategic thinking, allowing her to perceive both immediate and long-term consequences in human and military affairs. As Joan's adolescence progressed, the nature of her visions began to shift subtly. Early experiences were largely personal, focusing on moral conduct, spiritual discipline, and virtuous living. But gradually, the messages acquired a more expansive dimension. Directives concerning the defense of France and the need to support the Dauphin, Charles VII. These messages were extraordinary, not only in their content, but in the implications for a young peasant girl who had never traveled beyond her village. The visions demanded courage, initiative, and an understanding of social and political realities far beyond her immediate experience. Historical records, particularly the detailed accounts recorded during her posthumous rehabilitation trial, suggest that Joan did not experience these directives as optional. She described the saints as commanding her attention, their instructions pressing upon her with a quiet urgency that she could neither ignore nor misinterpret. For a teenager with minimal formal education and limited exposure to political affairs, this represented a remarkable convergence of spiritual experience and emerging strategic consciousness. She was, in essence, preparing herself for a world she had not yet entered, slowly rehearsing in her imagination the roles she would soon inhabit. It is worth noting that Joan's approach to these visions was methodical rather than impulsive. She consulted with her family, measured her responses, and considered practical obstacles before attempting any action. Unlike dramatic depictions in later literature and art, she did not immediately rush to the nearest lord or king with bold proclamations. Instead, she spent years quietly internalizing the instructions, weighing the moral imperatives against the practical limitations of her age, status, and resources. This patient preparation is one of the understated yet critical aspects of her historical significance. She cultivated an extraordinary inner life without abandoning the ordinary obligations of daily existence. By the mid-1422s, Joan's spiritual awakening had begun to intersect more directly with historical events. The English continued their campaigns in northern France, and local leaders faced mounting pressure to defend towns, fortresses, and fields. Rumors of despair, betrayal, and famine reached Domrémy intermittently, carried by traveling merchants, returning soldiers, or displaced villagers. In this context, Joan's visions, which increasingly emphasized national salvation, were not abstract moral exercises, but urgent calls to action. She began to consider, with careful attention, how a girl from a small village might participate in the larger story of France, and what risks, responsibilities, and strategies such involvement would entail. Yet even as she contemplated these matters, the question remained daunting. How could a young girl, with no military training, social rank, or political connections, hope to influence the course of a war that had already lasted generations? This tension between personal conviction and practical limitations, the interplay of extraordinary faith and ordinary circumstances, would define the next phase of Joan's life. It would shape not only her choices, but also the ways in which the people she encountered would perceive and respond to her, for better or worse. And so, in the quiet of Domrémy, amidst routine tasks and the slow passing of seasons, Joan's extraordinary sense of purpose quietly gathered strength. The voices persisted, the visions continued, and the young girl who had once tended animals and woven cloth began to imagine herself as something more than a mere observer of history. The question lingered, quietly but insistently. If the saints truly commanded her to act, what form would that action take? And how would she convince others to follow a vision that seemed, at first glance, impossible? By the mid-1422, Joan d'Arc's life in Domrémy had begun to take on a weight far beyond that of an ordinary peasant girl. The quiet rhythms of her village, the cycles of work and worship, and the gentle progression of seasons had instilled in her a disciplined mind, a keen observation of human behavior, and a patient approach to problem-solving. Yet, outside the boundaries of Domrémy, the world was unraveling in ways that few could ignore. France was a kingdom in crisis. The 100 Years' War, intermittent yet relentless, had devastated the northern provinces. Cities were occupied by English forces, towns changed hands with alarming frequency, and the crown struggled to assert authority. The political landscape was a patchwork of competing claims, fragile alliances, and local warlords who sometimes acted independently of any central command. For Joan, who had lived most of her life observing rather than acting, this chaos presented both a moral imperative and a practical challenge. The Dauphin, Charles VII, had not yet been crowned. His legitimacy was contested, and his court was ensnared in bureaucracy, intrigue, and factional disputes. Military commanders, though experienced, were often hesitant to act decisively, hampered by a lack of coordination and internal mistrust. The French populace, weary from decades of conflict, was skeptical of grand strategies or sudden shifts in leadership. Into this environment, Joan's visions pressed insistently. She believed that divine intervention demanded her participation in the affairs of the nation, and that she was uniquely suited to carry out this mandate. The first practical step in moving from spiritual conviction to tangible action involved leaving Domrémy. This, in itself, was no trivial matter. Peasant families in rural villages rarely traveled beyond their immediate region. Roads were uneven, dangerous, and subject to disruption by roving bands of mercenaries. Rivers had to be crossed with care, and travelers were expected to navigate political boundaries carefully, often presenting credentials or letters of introduction, a challenge for someone like Joan, who had neither rank nor formal support. Her journey would require preparation, patience, and, above all, courage. Joan's approach to these preparations reflected the qualities cultivated during her childhood: meticulous attention to detail, careful observation, and persistence. She began by confiding in those she trusted most: her parents, particularly Isabel, who had nurtured her spiritual sensitivity, and Jacques, who had taught her the importance of endurance and practicality. The family's support was cautious but significant. They recognized the extraordinary nature of Joan's convictions and the consistency with which she described her experiences. While they likely questioned the feasibility of her mission, they also understood that attempts to dissuade her would probably be futile. Joan's inner resolve was steady, and her sense of moral obligation, reinforced by years of spiritual reflection, made compromise difficult. By this point, Joan's visions had grown increasingly explicit. They no longer simply encouraged virtuous living or adherence to religious practice. They now contained strategic imperatives, specifying that she should support the Dauphin and help restore France's sovereignty. The content of these messages, as recorded in later trial transcripts, demonstrates an unusual level of specificity for someone with no formal military training. Joan received instructions not merely in generalities, but in guidance that would later shape real-world outcomes, such as the timing of movements, the importance of morale, and the psychological effect of her presence on soldiers and commanders. Historians have noted that the precision of these directions emerging in a young, untrained girl is both remarkable and difficult to explain purely in conventional terms. Even with such guidance, the path forward was fraught with uncertainty. Joan understood that approaching local authorities would require persuasion. She needed allies, resources, and legitimacy, all of which were scarce for a peasant girl. Moreover, the social structures of the time were rigid. Authority rested on rank, lineage, and wealth. Nobles and commanders were accustomed to deferring to experience, patronage, and military precedent. Convincing them to follow a 6-year-old girl would necessitate more than pious zeal. It required strategy, patience, and a demonstration of courage that transcended ordinary expectation. Joan's initial steps involved careful observation of the surrounding political environment. She monitored the movements of soldiers, noted patterns in the behavior of local lords, and began to assess how her interventions could create openings for larger actions. These were subtle, incremental calculations, almost imperceptible in their execution, but essential in forming a strategy she could implement once she left the village. This period of quiet analysis is often overlooked in popular narratives of Joan as an impulsive or divinely inspired figure. Yet it is precisely this patient, methodical preparation, rooted in the routines and observations of her childhood, that allowed her later interventions to succeed where others failed. The journey to action began in earnest when Joan resolved to approach Robert de Baudricourt, the local garrison commander in Vaucouleurs. This decision, seemingly simple on the surface, was fraught with difficulty. Vaucouleurs lay several miles from Domrémy, across uneven terrain, and under the watch of both friendly and hostile forces. Moreover, Baudricourt, a man responsible for the safety and order of the region, had every reason to dismiss or ridicule a young girl claiming divine instruction. Joan's strategy, therefore, required both boldness and careful timing. She needed to convey certainty without arrogance, conviction without defiance, and spiritual authority without transgressing social norms. Historical accounts describe her initial audience with Baudricourt as challenging. The commander, accustomed to dealing with soldiers, envoys, and local petitioners, was skeptical. Yet Joan's persistence and clarity gradually overcame his hesitation. She did not rely on dramatic displays or emotional appeals alone. She demonstrated knowledge of local affairs, expressed a deep understanding of moral and strategic imperatives, and presented herself with a composure unusual for her age. Over time, her demeanor, combined with the apparent consistency of her claims, began to soften the skepticism of those she encountered. It is worth noting that Joan's rise to influence was incremental. She did not immediately command armies or dictate strategy. Rather, she moved step by step, gaining the trust of officials, building legitimacy through patience, and allowing her personal courage to gradually validate her claims. This methodical ascent reflects the slow, deliberate processes of her early life. Observing, learning, reflecting, and then acting with precision. Her childhood, filled with routine tasks, careful observation, and patient spiritual discipline, had prepared her to navigate the complexities of a fractured political world. Even as she moved closer to fulfilling the visions that had guided her for years, uncertainty remained. Could a young girl truly sway the course of a nation? Would her messages be accepted as divine guidance, or dismissed as the fanciful musings of a peasant. And even if she succeeded in gaining an audience with the Dauphin, could she influence events in a war that had lasted decades and worn down generations of soldiers and leaders? These questions lingered not only for Joan, but for the world around her. The villagers of Domrémy, the local authorities, and the broader kingdom of France were poised on the edge of change, unaware that a quiet, disciplined girl had begun to translate visions into action. In the midst of routine, in the rhythm of domestic chores, in the slow passage of seasons, the extraordinary was quietly preparing to emerge. And so, the stage was set. Joan d'Arc, a girl of humble origins, steeped in faith, patience, and observation, was ready to step into the larger, chaotic world that had long existed beyond the borders of Domrémy. The question now became urgent and inescapable. When she moved beyond the village and into the heart of a nation at war, would she be able to fulfill the visions that had guided her so meticulously, or would the forces of doubt, politics, and conflict prove too great for even the most steadfast conviction? By the early 15th century, France was a land caught in a slow, grinding state of disarray. The 100 Years' War, which had begun in 1337 as a dynastic struggle over the French throne, was no longer merely a question of kingship. It had become a protracted conflict that penetrated every level of society. Cities were fortified, fields were abandoned or overworked, and villages like Domrémy were acutely aware of the oscillating fortunes of local and foreign armies. Life was marked not only by the rhythms of agriculture and domestic labor, but also by the uncertainty of what soldiers might appear on a given day, what taxes or levies would be demanded, and how alliances might shift overnight. The conflict between England and France had deepened over generations, becoming a war as much of attrition and logistics as of pitched battles. In northern France, English forces had captured key towns and ports, securing supply lines and imposing administrative control that the French crown struggled to contest. Meanwhile, factions within the French nobility vied for influence, their loyalties divided between regional power, personal gain, and, in some cases, temporary allegiance to the English crown. This decentralized political structure made coordinated military action extraordinarily difficult. Orders from the king were frequently delayed, misunderstood, or resisted entirely, leaving local commanders to operate with varying degrees of autonomy and competence. The consequences for ordinary people were severe. Peasant communities, dependent on harvests and the protection of local lords, lived with the constant threat of pillage. Fields could be trampled, stored grain confiscated, and homes burned in the crossfire of skirmishes or retaliatory raids. Travel beyond a village was fraught with risk, as unprotected roads became hunting grounds for bandits or foraging soldiers. For families like Joan d'Arc's, these conditions demanded vigilance, resourcefulness, and a detailed awareness of the surrounding terrain and population movements. Children learned early to recognize the signs of approaching danger, to read the behavior of neighbors, and to anticipate disruptions to their daily routines. Amid this turmoil, the monarchy itself struggled to maintain legitimacy. Charles VI, known as Charles the Mad, had long been incapacitated by mental illness, leaving France effectively leaderless at critical moments. In his absence, regional governors, dukes, and counts often acted according to their own interests rather than the demands of the crown. Charles VII, the Dauphin and heir to the throne, faced the challenge of asserting his authority in a kingdom divided both geographically and politically. His legitimacy was contested by internal rivals and by the English crown, which sought to enforce claims established through the Treaty of Troyes. In practice, much of the kingdom resembled a patchwork of autonomous regions, each with its own defensive strategies, loyalties, and priorities. The military landscape of France during this period was complex and frustratingly slow-moving. Armies were composed largely of mercenaries or feudal levies, whose loyalty depended on pay, reputation, or immediate survival, rather than patriotic duty. Supplies were a constant concern. Sieges could last months because armies lacked sufficient food, and attrition through starvation, disease, and desertion often caused more casualties than combat itself. Commanders needed not only tactical skill, but logistical foresight, patience, and the ability to negotiate with local populations for resources, tasks that required meticulous planning and communication. The chaos of war, combined with the inefficiencies of medieval governance, meant that opportunities were fleeting, and even minor successes required careful orchestration. The societal consequences of this extended conflict were also profound. Traditional hierarchies, while still nominally in place, were strained by the repeated demands of warfare. Nobles were called upon to provide soldiers and support, towns were taxed repeatedly, and peasants bore the brunt of confiscation, forced labor, and occasional conscription. In rural villages, daily life became a matter of negotiation. Families had to maintain production, ensure survival, and cultivate networks of trust to withstand both human and environmental challenges. In this sense, the ordinary routines of village life, planting, harvesting, preparing food stores, and attending church, were inseparable from the larger forces of war. Each task, however mundane, carried potential consequences that could ripple outward in ways few villagers fully comprehended. Religion, as always, provided a framework for understanding and coping with uncertainty. Parish priests, monks, and nuns offered guidance, interpreted omens, and mediated disputes. Church rituals punctuated the year, creating a sense of temporal order even amid political and military chaos. Villagers were trained from an early age to read the signs of divine favor or disfavor in everyday events. For a girl like Joan d'Arc, this religious infrastructure provided both context and validation for her spiritual experiences. The saints and angels she claimed to hear were situated within a well-established framework of moral authority, ritual practice, and collective belief. These voices, while extraordinary in their specificity, would have been comprehensible to a society that saw the divine as intimately involved in the human world. It is also important to understand the geography of conflict. Northern France was dotted with fortified towns, castles, and walled cities that acted as both defensive strongpoints and centers of administration. Control of these locations was essential for sustaining armies and securing resources. Roads, rivers, and forests were not merely backdrops, but strategic assets and potential hazards. Villages like Domrémy existed in the shadow of these larger operations, where distant battles could affect local security, trade, and agricultural productivity. Even small skirmishes could disrupt supply chains, prompting famine or forced migration. For someone observant and methodical, these dynamics were critical to understand not just as abstract concepts, but as practical realities shaping daily life. Local governance, too, was complicated by overlapping jurisdictions and conflicting loyalties. Lords and vassals owed allegiance to the king, yet often pursued their own interests. Communities negotiated with multiple authorities simultaneously, balancing obligations to secular and ecclesiastical power. In this environment, rumors and intelligence, sometimes accurate, sometimes misleading, were vital. A single piece of information about troop movements or political agreements could determine whether a village prepared for defense or continued routine work. The stakes of knowing when to act and when to wait were high, instilling in observers like Joan a heightened sense of caution, discernment, and patience. The broader cultural implications of the war were equally pervasive. Literature, sermons, and public discourse emphasized loyalty, courage, and divine justice, framing the conflict as a moral as well as political struggle. Communities internalized these messages, integrating them into daily life, from the recitation of prayers to the songs sung during work. These cultural touchstones reinforced a worldview in which the extraordinary, whether divine intervention or miraculous deliverance, was always a possibility. For Joan, the confluence of personal piety and national crisis created fertile ground for her sense of purpose. She internalized both the suffering of ordinary people and the symbolic importance of defending the kingdom, shaping a vision that was both practical and spiritual. Even as the conflict dragged on, it produced subtle openings for intervention. Battles were not constant, but sporadic. Lulls in fighting allowed for reconnaissance, negotiation, and strategic planning. Armies moved slowly, fortifications were imperfect, and local authorities often responded cautiously rather than decisively. These slow-moving dynamics created opportunities for individuals with initiative, insight, and courage to influence outcomes disproportionate to their social rank. Joan's growing awareness of these dynamics, coupled with her spiritual convictions, set the stage for her eventual emergence from Domrémy into the turbulent political world of northern France. Yet despite these observations, the challenges were immense. A girl from a rural village would confront entrenched hierarchies, skepticism from officials, and the sheer brutality of warfare. The experiences of ordinary people demonstrated that survival required adaptability, resilience, and careful judgment. For Joan, translating her visions into effective action would demand all of these qualities, as well as a capacity for patience that was rooted in years of observing the slow, methodical rhythms of both village and battlefield. And so, France remained a land suspended between chaos and the possibility of order. A kingdom where the extraordinary might emerge from the ordinary if the right combination of courage, insight, and timing occurred. For Joan d'Arc, the lessons of her village, the voices she had heard, and the careful observations of her surroundings coalesced into a single, pressing question. Could a young peasant girl navigate the intricacies of politics, war, and faith to make a tangible difference in the fate of an entire nation? By the mid-1422s, Joan d'Arc had spent years immersed in the quiet, repetitive rhythms of Domrémy, cultivating a patient awareness of her environment and listening intently to the voices she believed guided her. Yet the world outside her village, the fractured territories of France, the English-controlled towns, and the hesitant, divided French nobility, continued to exert pressure on ordinary life. Villagers struggled to keep their fields productive, livestock safe, and families fed, while news of distant battles and sieges traveled slowly but inevitably through local networks. For Joan, the accumulation of these observations over time, coupled with the increasingly directive content of her visions, created a profound tension. How could she, a young peasant girl, act in a world that seemed both chaotic and unyielding? The voices, persistent and insistent, left little room for delay. Joan recounted later that they instructed her to go beyond the borders of Domrémy, to seek out the Dauphin, and to support him in reclaiming the French throne. The clarity of these directives contrasted sharply with the uncertainty of her practical circumstances. She had no formal authority, no military training, and minimal experience interacting with the educated elite who controlled armies and resources. In most contexts, her ambition would have been dismissed as fantasy. Yet the combination of spiritual conviction and methodical observation had given her a sense of inevitability. She could not ignore the call, even as she carefully considered the obstacles. Preparation for action began gradually, in a manner consistent with her personality and upbringing. Joan confided her intentions to her parents, seeking their counsel and, perhaps more importantly, their tacit approval. Historical records suggest that Isabelle Romay, her mother, provided measured support, acknowledging the extraordinary nature of her daughter's claims, while balancing the practical risks of travel and political engagement. Jacques d'Arc, her father, reinforced the need for courage and perseverance, drawing upon his own experience navigating the uncertainties of peasant life in a war-torn region. Their guidance did not diminish the audacity of Joan's mission. Rather, it allowed her to approach it with a tempered determination, combining spiritual zeal with grounded pragmatism. Travel beyond Domrémy was an endeavor fraught with risk. Roads were irregular and poorly maintained. Rivers and streams could be treacherous to cross, and the presence of mercenary bands or local militias meant that even short journeys carried the possibility of violence. Joan's first objective was Vaucouleurs, a fortified town under the command of Robert de Baudricourt, who held both military authority and regional influence. Gaining an audience with him was essential, as he could grant her the legitimacy, protection, and connections required to advance her mission. Yet approaching him posed significant challenges. A young girl, alone, claiming divine instruction, would likely be met with skepticism at best. ridicule at worst, and suspicion or hostility at worst of all. Joan approached these challenges methodically. She timed her travel to avoid the most dangerous periods, prepared a concise explanation of her mission, and carried herself with a composure that belied her years. The manner in which she presented herself, calm, direct, and unwavering, was critical to overcoming the initial disbelief of those she encountered. Historical accounts from her trial describe how her clarity of speech, confidence, and earnest demeanor gradually persuaded those around her to at least listen. Her preparation, patience, and careful observation had not been wasted. They enabled her to translate spiritual conviction into a persuasive personal presence. Upon reaching Vaucouleurs, Joan encountered the expected resistance. Robert de Baudricourt, responsible for the safety and order of the region, was initially dismissive. It was not merely a question of gender or age. It was the absurdity, from a practical perspective, of a girl claiming divine guidance in the midst of ongoing military and political crises. Yet Joan's persistence was deliberate rather than reckless. She returned repeatedly, demonstrating consistency in her claims, moral seriousness, and an unshakable commitment to her mission. Over time, these qualities softened Baudricourt's skepticism, allowing him to provide the initial support she needed: an escort, letters of introduction, and eventual permission to continue toward the Dauphin. The period leading up to her departure from Vaucouleurs was characterized by both strategic planning and personal preparation. Joan was not impulsive. She carefully observed military movements, understood the geography of her route, and cultivated an awareness of the social and political hierarchies she would encounter. She studied the behaviors of soldiers, the tendencies of local officials, and the communication patterns within the French court. These small, almost imperceptible details formed the basis of a practical strategy that would allow her to navigate a world otherwise inaccessible to someone of her status. Joan's ability to integrate the extraordinary and the ordinary was a hallmark of this phase of her life. Her visions had provided moral and spiritual imperatives. Her observations and practical planning allowed her to operationalize them. In this sense, the lines between mystical instruction and real-world action were fluid. Her faith guided her objectives, but her success depended on careful attention to terrain, people, and circumstance. She moved forward incrementally, testing assumptions, observing responses, and adapting her approach in response to feedback from those around her. This period of preparation also highlighted her growing understanding of leadership and influence. Joan recognized that command did not require formal rank alone. It required credibility, consistency, and a visible commitment to principle. By demonstrating courage, clarity, and composure, she was already exercising a form of authority that would become crucial in her later interactions with soldiers and commanders. She was learning to convert personal conviction into social influence, a skill that would prove decisive in the campaigns to come. Yet even as she gained confidence and practical experience, Joan faced profound uncertainty. Would the Dauphin accept the authority of a young girl from a rural village? Could she persuade experienced commanders to follow guidance rooted in visions rather than conventional military doctrine? And if she failed, what consequences might she face, both personally and for the people who had placed their trust in her? These questions loomed over her, emphasizing the tension between spiritual conviction and worldly pragmatism that defined much of her early development. Historical records, particularly the transcripts from her posthumous rehabilitation trial, reveal the depth of Joan's contemplation during this period. She weighed moral imperatives, personal safety, and the practical realities of travel and persuasion. Her methodical approach suggests that even in the midst of visionary experience, she remained acutely aware of human behavior, social hierarchies, and the potential consequences of her actions. In essence, she was rehearsing the steps of her mission with the same patience and diligence that had characterized her childhood, turning abstract imperatives into concrete, actionable plans. Ultimately, Joan's decision to act was both inevitable and remarkable. The accumulation of years spent in observation, labor, and spiritual reflection had converged with the pressing needs of a nation at war.
Her journey to Vaucouleurs was the first tangible step in translating personal conviction into historical impact. The extraordinary had begun to emerge from the ordinary, carried forward by patience, careful planning, and an unyielding commitment to duty, as she understood it. And yet, even with all the preparation, one question remained unanswered. When she finally reached the Dauphin and presented herself at the heart of a kingdom in chaos, would her vision be sufficient to overcome the skepticism, fear, and political inertia of a war-weary France? After months of preparation and travel, Joan d'Arc's journey beyond Domrémy reached a critical juncture. Having persuaded Robert de Baudricourt of her divine mission, she was provided with an escort and letters of introduction to present to the Dauphin, Charles VII, in the court at Chinon. For a young peasant girl from a remote village, this represented not only a geographic transition, but a profound social leap. The court was a world of ceremony, hierarchy, and politics, utterly unlike the quiet routines of Domrémy. Courtiers measured every gesture, scrutinized appearances, and weighed words carefully. Even a minor misstep could damage reputation or hinder access to power. Joan, however, carried with her the steady composure developed through years of observing and participating in the disciplined life of her village. Her initial reception at Chinon was cautious. The Dauphin, aware of rumors surrounding her journey and her claims of divine guidance, required verification before taking her seriously. He was a young man under immense pressure, his legitimacy contested, the English entrenched in northern France, and internal French factions skeptical of centralized authority. Courtiers and advisors examined Joan with equal measures of curiosity and suspicion. It is important to note that this was not the dramatic, immediate recognition often depicted in popular portrayals. The process was slow, deliberate, and grounded in careful observation, precisely the sort of environment in which Joan's methodical preparation would serve her well. Joan's strategy in these initial encounters was simple but effective. She presented herself with clarity, confidence, and humility. She described her visions and her mission, not in grandiose or theatrical terms, but with a precision that reflected both her spiritual conviction and her awareness of courtly expectations. Her demeanor, a combination of calm determination and attentive respect, gradually impressed those who met her. She demonstrated knowledge of local geography, military positions, and the broader situation of France that seemed improbable for a girl of her background. Even skeptics could not easily dismiss her as naive or purely fanciful. Her observations, combined with her moral authority, lent credibility to her extraordinary claims. The Dauphin's advisors, while intrigued, approached Joan cautiously. Historical records indicate that they tested her knowledge of people, places, and events, seeking to gauge whether she could have obtained information through ordinary means. Joan's consistent responses, often delivered with deliberate precision, reinforced the impression that she possessed insight beyond her years and social station. Over time, she earned provisional approval to accompany military operations, not as a commander in the traditional sense, but as a moral and spiritual presence whose confidence and clarity could influence troops and officers alike. Joan's integration into the military sphere was gradual. She did not immediately lead armies or dictate strategy. Instead, she observed, learned, and began to participate in small ways, such as advising on troop movements, boosting morale, and delivering messages between commanders. Her presence in the camp was unconventional. A young girl in armor, steadfast in her beliefs, who inspired soldiers through personal example rather than formal authority. The daily life of military operations, long marches, logistical planning, and periods of tedium suited her methodical temperament. She could anticipate supply issues, notice patterns in enemy behavior, and advise on timing and positioning, all while maintaining the spiritual composure that had characterized her life in Domrémy. The Siege of Orléans, the campaign that would cement Joan's historical significance, was approached with this same meticulous attention to detail. She advised on where to concentrate forces, when to press attacks, and how to maintain morale among troops who had been demoralized by months of stalemate. While her role did not replace the strategic experience of seasoned commanders, her presence and insistence on action had a tangible psychological effect. Soldiers reported renewed energy, and officers found their decisions increasingly informed by her observations. Even the simplest interventions, encouraging soldiers to hold positions, timing attacks to exploit weak points, or inspiring confidence before engagement, demonstrated her practical understanding of military operations, cultivated through years of careful observation and reflection. Joan's influence was also symbolic. In a nation divided and demoralized, her steadfast conviction, an apparent divine mandate, offered a focal point around which disparate groups could rally. Nobles, soldiers, and commoners alike were inspired by her courage, precision, and clarity of purpose. The ordinary rhythms of life, morning drills, ration distributions, camp routines, were infused with renewed energy simply by her presence. Her example showed that leadership could be expressed not only through rank or battlefield experience, but through moral authority, consistency, and the disciplined application of observation and judgment. Yet even at the height of her emerging influence, challenges remained. The English forces continued to occupy key territories. Internal French factions still resisted centralized authority, and the practical realities of warfare threatened the most carefully laid plans. Joan's reliance on spiritual guidance sometimes placed her at odds with experienced commanders, who were accustomed to making decisions grounded in conventional military logic. The delicate balance between visionary conviction and practical execution required constant adjustment, patience, and strategic thinking. Joan's ability to navigate these tensions reflected the continuity of her development from the disciplined routines of Domrémy to the complex social and military hierarchies of the French court. During this period, Joan also developed a nuanced understanding of human behavior. She observed fear, hesitation, ambition, and loyalty, both in soldiers and in nobles. Her effectiveness depended not only on her ability to inspire action, but on her ability to anticipate responses, mediate conflicts, and identify the precise moment when influence could be exerted most effectively. These skills, grounded in her early experiences of careful observation and patient adaptation, allowed her to operate within environments that might otherwise have been hostile to someone of her age, gender, and social status. By the end of this initial phase at court and on campaign, Joan had established herself as both a moral and practical presence in the war effort. She had demonstrated the capacity to bridge the gap between divine instruction and worldly exigency, translating spiritual conviction into concrete outcomes that influenced the course of events. Her journey from a quiet village in Domrémy to the political and military heart of France was a testament to the extraordinary potential of disciplined observation, patient preparation, and moral courage. And yet, even with these accomplishments, one critical question remained unresolved. Could this young girl, extraordinary though she was, sustain her influence in the face of sustained military conflict, political intrigue, and the relentless pressures of war? Or would the weight of history, as it had challenged so many before her, ultimately overwhelm her resolve? By the spring of 1429, France's political and military landscape remained fractured, but one event held the potential to unify the kingdom symbolically and strategically: the coronation of Charles VII at Reims. In medieval France, the city of Reims was not merely a ceremonial venue, it was a locus of legitimacy. Since the time of Clovis, the first king to convert to Christianity, Reims had been the traditional site of royal consecration. To be crowned here was to be recognized as the divinely sanctioned ruler of France, a critical factor in consolidating authority during a period of political instability. For Charles VII, whose claim to the throne had been contested and undermined by English occupation of key northern territories, reaching Reims with the necessary ceremonies intact was both a logistical and symbolic challenge. Joan d'Arc, though young and of humble origin, had become a central figure in making this event possible. Her military interventions had created conditions for travel, clearing the path of English and Burgundian forces that previously obstructed communication and supply lines. However, the task of organizing a coronation was far more complex than simply capturing territory. Medieval ceremony demanded meticulous attention to ritual, protocol, and the coordination of resources across multiple domains. Joan, as a participant in these operations, observed and contributed to the coordination in ways that leveraged both her practical abilities and her capacity to inspire action. The preparations for the coronation were extensive. Reims itself, though traditionally the site of royal consecration, had been affected by decades of war. Buildings required repair. Local supplies had to be secured, and security measures implemented to protect the king and the assembled nobility. Every detail, from the provision of food and wine to the allocation of ceremonial garments and regalia, was critical. Mistakes could result not only in logistical failure, but also in symbolic humiliation, which would undermine the perceived legitimacy of the coronation. The planning process was slow, deliberate, and painstaking, emphasizing the bureaucratic realities behind what modern audiences might imagine as a moment of simple triumph. Joan's role, though not that of an administrator, involved facilitating these preparations through her influence and the trust she had cultivated among commanders and courtiers. Her presence encouraged cooperation, helped maintain morale among troops, securing the surrounding territories, and ensured that various local authorities coordinated effectively. Soldiers, often unaccustomed to the rigors of ceremonial precision, relied on her guidance to balance practical military operations with the demands of courtly observance. In this way, she bridged the divide between martial necessity and ceremonial obligation, ensuring that both could proceed without conflict. One of the significant logistical challenges was transportation. The roads between liberated towns and Reims were damaged or obstructed by years of conflict, requiring careful planning to move both people and supplies. Armies, horses, and essential goods had to be coordinated to prevent bottlenecks. Timing was critical. Too slow, and the opportunity for symbolic advantage could be lost. Too fast, and supply chains might fail. Joan observed these operations with an attentiveness that mirrored her early experiences in Domrémy, noting the importance of sequencing, pacing, and the subtle interplay between terrain and human behavior. Ceremonial elements also demanded attention to detail. The coronation was not a casual affair. It required adherence to centuries of ritual, liturgical sequences, the roles of bishops and nobles, and the positioning of heralds all had to be coordinated precisely. Missed cues or errors could be interpreted as signs of divine disfavor, a particularly sensitive concern given the religious legitimacy associated with the event. Joan's presence, with her reputation for spiritual insight, lent a moral dimension to these preparations. Her consistency, composure, and apparent divine sanction provided reassurance to participants that the event could proceed without spiritual mishap. Moreover, the political dimension was ever present. Nobles who accompanied Charles VII to Reims were acutely aware that their cooperation, or lack thereof, could affect territorial negotiations and influence power dynamics long after the coronation ended. Joan, as a symbol of moral and spiritual authority, reinforced loyalty and commitment, subtly shaping interactions among key figures. Her influence was exercised not through formal commands, but through the demonstration of conviction, composure, and the capacity to inspire confidence skills she had honed from years of observing human behavior in the village and on campaign. The ceremony itself was a slow-moving sequence of carefully choreographed actions. Processions, oaths, anointings, and proclamations proceeded according to ancient precedent. Every participant had a designated role. Every gesture carried symbolic weight, and every visual element, from the banners displayed along the streets to the placement of sacred oils, was steeped in tradition. Joan, attuned to both symbolic and practical significance, recognized that the success of the ceremony depended on adherence to these details as much as on military triumph. The meticulous execution of ritual reinforced the perception of divine legitimacy, which was essential in consolidating Charles VII's authority in a kingdom still vulnerable to internal and external challenges. Even mundane aspects, such as the timing of meals, accommodation of participants, and security of religious relics, carried implications for the success of the coronation. Failures in logistics could translate into delays, embarrassment, or loss of confidence among nobility and clergy. Joan's involvement in observing and facilitating these details underscored her ability to operate across multiple domains, spiritual, military, and administrative. She navigated the intersection of these spheres with the same patient attentiveness that had characterized her upbringing, ensuring that practical realities did not undermine symbolic significance. Throughout the process, Joan maintained a balance between humility and presence. She did not attempt to dominate proceedings or assert authority in areas beyond her expertise. Instead, she exercised influence through example, moral conviction, and the trust she had earned from commanders, courtiers, and the king himself. Her capacity to inspire action without formal rank highlighted the intersection of personal character, spiritual authority, and practical competence, a combination rarely found and critical for the successful execution of such a complex ceremonial event. As the coronation approached, tension mounted. The outcome of the ceremony would signal not only Charles VII's legitimacy, but also the broader trajectory of France's recovery from decades of conflict. Every misstep, whether in military coordination, ceremonial execution, or social negotiation, had the potential to reverberate through the kingdom. Joan's role, subtle though it was, became a stabilizing force, demonstrating that disciplined preparation, moral authority, and attention to detail could shape outcomes in ways that transcended formal hierarchy. And yet, even as the crown was prepared, banners hung, and participants assembled, one question lingered. Could the symbolic act of coronation, with all its careful preparation and ritual precision, truly alter the course of a war-torn nation? Or would the practical realities of politics and conflict continue to undermine the fragile hope embodied in this moment? On the morning of the 17th of July, 1429, the city of Reims began to stir, with a combination of anticipation, preparation, and apprehension. Though the ceremony itself would be remembered for its religious and symbolic significance, the events of that day were underpinned by months of logistical planning, military coordination, and careful diplomacy. France, fractured by decades of war, now looked to the coronation as a potential turning point. An opportunity to unite competing factions under a single, divinely sanctioned ruler. Joan d'Arc, having facilitated the conditions for the Dauphin's safe passage and bolstered the morale of accompanying forces, stood at the periphery of both ceremony and consequence, observing, advising, and embodying a presence that bridged the spiritual and practical realms. Reims was far from untouched by the war. Though loyal forces had cleared the immediate approach to the city, the surrounding countryside remained contested, and supply lines had to be monitored closely. Every stage of the procession, from the staging of banners to the positioning of the clergy, relied on coordination among individuals accustomed to vastly different rhythms of life. Soldiers, accustomed to the unpredictability of battle, were now tasked with ceremonial duties, while courtiers, trained in protocol, had to contend with the unexpected presence of troops in the streets. Joan, with her characteristic attentiveness, observed these tensions, noting where friction might disrupt proceedings and how minor adjustments could smooth the intersection of military necessity and ceremonial expectation. The arrival of Charles VII at the cathedral itself was a moment of profound symbolic weight. Every gesture, the folding of the hands in prayer, the bowing to the assembled clergy, the placement of the crown was governed by centuries of precedent. Yet behind the ritualized surface lay practical concerns. Clergy and nobility needed to ensure the sequence of events preserved not only religious significance, but also political legitimacy. Any misstep could be construed as a sign of weakness, uncertainty, or divine disfavor, all of which had potential military and diplomatic repercussions. Joan, though not responsible for the ritual itself, influenced the proceedings through her moral presence. She encouraged vigilance among the troops, reassured hesitant courtiers, and embodied a narrative of providential purpose that gave participants confidence in the unfolding sequence. The ceremony proceeded slowly, with each element unfolding according to meticulous timing. Liturgical chants resonated within the cathedral. Incense wafted through the high ceilings, and sacred objects were handled with precision. The anointing of Charles VII with holy oil, a ritual central to his claim, symbolized both spiritual authority and divine endorsement. In an era where divine legitimacy underpinned political power, this act carried extraordinary significance. For the assembled nobility, clergy, and military leaders, the ritual confirmed the king's right to govern and provided a focal point for allegiance and coordination across the kingdom. Joan's role, though subtle, was amplified by the perception of her as divinely guided. Soldiers reported a renewed determination, motivated not solely by duty, but by the presence of a figure who exemplified courage, faith, and focus. Nobles and courtiers, while politically astute, found themselves influenced by her unwavering conviction, which suggested that events were guided by a providential hand. The blending of spiritual authority with practical effect. Her presence, her clarity, and her moral consistency reinforced the perception that the coronation was more than a ceremonial display. It was a turning point in the nation's fortunes. Following the formal rituals, attention turned to the practical challenges of securing Charles VII's authority beyond the cathedral walls. Letters of appointment, military commissions, and proclamations needed dissemination. Troops required logistical support. Local leaders had to be persuaded to reinforce the king's position. Joan's involvement in these operations was indirect but influential. Her prior experience in observing human behavior, assessing timing, and maintaining morale allowed her to advise commanders, encourage coordination, and identify potential obstacles to implementation. Her influence was exercised quietly, through example and insight, yet it had measurable effects on the efficiency and effectiveness of post-ceremony operations. The broader political consequences of the coronation were not immediate or absolute. Some regions remained loyal to the English, others skeptical of Charles VII's authority, and local nobles weighed their allegiance cautiously. Yet the symbolism of the event, reinforced by the presence of Joan d'Arc and the coordination of troops and clergy, began to shift perceptions. News of the coronation traveled slowly along trade routes, rivers, and roads, reaching distant communities and influencing their response to ongoing military and political pressures. Even small actions, such as the placement of garrisons along strategic routes or the reaffirmation of local allegiances, were shaped by the credibility and symbolic authority imparted by the coronation. Joan's participation in these broader outcomes was emblematic of her unique role in the war. She was neither a conventional military commander nor a formal political advisor. Rather, she operated at the intersection of moral, spiritual, and practical influence. Soldiers followed her example, courtiers respected her consistency, and commanders took her insights seriously, not because of rank, but because she demonstrated a persistent ability to integrate observation, planning, and conviction into actionable guidance. The slow-moving rhythms of bureaucracy, ceremony, and military planning were, in this sense, as critical as the battles themselves. Joan's capacity to navigate these rhythms effectively amplified her impact on the trajectory of events. Despite the success of the coronation, challenges persisted. Military campaigns continued in contested regions, supplies remained tenuous, and the English and their allies sought to capitalize on any sign of weakness. The cohesion generated by the coronation was fragile, requiring sustained effort to translate symbolic legitimacy into practical consolidation of power. Joan, understanding both the symbolic and tangible dimensions of authority, continued to move among troops and commanders, advising on operations, maintaining morale, and observing developments with careful attention to detail. Her ability to act across multiple spheres, ceremonial, spiritual, and military, remained central to the ongoing efforts to stabilize and unify France. Even at the conclusion of the coronation, one essential question lingered. Could the momentum generated by ceremony, moral authority, and symbolic legitimacy be transformed into lasting political and military success? Or would the slow, unpredictable machinery of war, factionalism, and geography undermine the fragile gains of this moment? Joan, who had already demonstrated extraordinary foresight and discipline, faced the challenge of ensuring that the extraordinary potential of the coronation would survive the slow, grinding realities of 15th century warfare. With the coronation of Charles VII at Reims completed, France experienced a moment of rare unity and symbolic clarity. The young king had been anointed in the traditional, divinely sanctioned manner that linked his authority to centuries of royal precedent. And for the first time in years, his legitimacy was widely recognized, at least in theory. Yet the realities of governance and warfare remained pressing. Northern territories were still under English and Burgundian control. Fortifications required ongoing management, and local lords maintained varying degrees of loyalty and autonomy. The coronation had been a necessary step, but it was only a preliminary one. Translating symbolic success into tangible political and military gains was a far slower and more demanding process. Joan d'Arc's role in this phase of consolidation was crucial. Her influence extended beyond mere inspiration. It manifested in the practical coordination of troops, the observation of battlefield conditions, and the psychological reinforcement of morale among soldiers and commanders. While she did not issue formal orders in the way experienced military leaders did, her presence and counsel were highly respected. Commanders found that her insights, rooted in careful observation and a deep understanding of human behavior, often clarified ambiguities in planning or timing. This combination of moral authority and practical acumen allowed Joan to act as a bridge between symbolic legitimacy and operational execution, a link that few others could have fulfilled. The immediate military consequences of the coronation were apparent in subsequent campaigns. Troops who had previously been hesitant or disorganized exhibited renewed determination. Siege operations, patrols, and supply movements were conducted with greater coordination and purpose. Joan, familiar with both strategic geography and the rhythms of human behavior, contributed by identifying vulnerabilities in enemy positions, advising on optimal timing for attacks, and supporting commanders in maintaining discipline and morale. These interventions, though incremental, accumulated into tangible advantages on the battlefield. Soldiers reported a sense of renewed confidence, influenced not only by the symbolic authority of the coronation, but also by the direct, attentive presence of a figure who embodied courage, conviction, and focus. Beyond the battlefield, the coronation also produced subtle shifts in political allegiance. Nobles who had previously hedged their loyalty observed the ceremony and perceived the king's legitimacy as reinforced by divine sanction and popular support. Joan's presence, widely regarded as evidence of providential favor, amplified these perceptions. Courtiers, town leaders, and regional lords began to coordinate more readily, and the previously fractured administrative machinery of the kingdom began to function with slightly more cohesion. These effects were slow, measured in weeks and months rather than days, yet they represented a meaningful consolidation of authority that had eluded the French crown for decades. Joan's methods remained consistent with her earlier experiences. She balanced observation with action, patience with initiative, and moral authority with practical engagement. Her influence was rarely overt. She did not replace commanders or administrators, but augmented their capacity to act effectively. In this sense, she exemplified a form of leadership that was both subtle and profound, rooted in disciplined attention to detail, an understanding of human dynamics, and a steadfast commitment to purpose. The ability to inspire and coordinate without formal rank, and to combine symbolic significance with practical intervention, would become a defining feature of her contributions throughout the ongoing campaigns of the 100 Years' War. Even with these successes, challenges remained immediate and tangible. English and Burgundian forces retained control of strategic towns and fortresses, complicating communication and supply. Regional lords had varied levels of allegiance, and some were motivated by self-interest rather than loyalty. Troop morale was fragile, vulnerable to setbacks, disease, and the logistical difficulties inherent in prolonged campaigns. Joan's capacity to maintain momentum relied not only on her courage and insight, but on the slow, deliberate processes of observation, planning, and incremental influence that she had honed since her earliest days in Domrémy. One of the remarkable aspects of this period was Joan's ability to integrate spiritual conviction with practical execution. Her visions had provided motivation and moral clarity. Yet, it was her capacity to translate these into tangible outcomes through careful observation, strategic patience, and personal example that shaped the effectiveness of her influence. Soldiers and commanders may have been inspired by the notion of divine sanction, but the day-to-day realities of military operations demanded consistent attention to supply, timing, terrain, and human behavior. Joan's blend of faith, patience, and practical intelligence allowed her to operate effectively within this complex web of requirements. The campaigns following the coronation also underscored the fragility of symbolic legitimacy when unaccompanied by action. Without ongoing military and administrative follow-through, even a coronation steeped in tradition and divine ritual could fail to consolidate power. Joan's contributions, therefore, were not ancillary. They were integral to the translation of ceremony into operational capability. She acted as both catalyst and stabilizer, facilitating coordination, enhancing morale, and ensuring that symbolic gains were reinforced by practical measures. As weeks and months progressed, the tangible effects of the coronation and Joan's participation became increasingly evident. Previously resistant lords began to commit troops. Logistical operations became more predictable, and small victories accumulated into momentum. Yet the broader war remained far from won. England and its allies still commanded key territories. Local loyalties fluctuated, and unforeseen setbacks could disrupt even the most carefully planned operations. Joan's effectiveness depended on her continued observation, adaptability, and unwavering focus. Qualities cultivated over years of patient attention to the rhythms of both village life and military operations. In reflecting on this period, it becomes clear that the intersection of symbolic legitimacy, logistical planning, and moral influence was central to the consolidation of Charles VII's authority. The coronation at Reims was more than a ceremonial event. It was a pivot around which practical, psychological, and spiritual factors converged. Joan d'Arc, through her unique blend of disciplined observation, moral conviction, and subtle operational guidance, ensured that this convergence produced meaningful outcomes on the battlefield and in the court. Yet one question lingered, underscoring the precariousness of her position and the broader challenges of medieval warfare. Could the momentum generated by symbolic ceremony, moral authority, and careful coordination be sustained in the long term? Or would the persistent forces of politics, geography, and conflict gradually erode the gains achieved at Reims? The answer, though uncertain at that moment, would shape the remainder of Joan's extraordinary campaign and influence the trajectory of France for years to come. The city of Orléans, perched on the northern bank of the Loire River, had long been a strategic jewel in the contest between the French and the English. By 1428, it had become the focal point of a protracted siege. For months, English forces had encircled the city, cutting off supplies, disrupting communication, and attempting to weaken resistance through attrition. The siege was emblematic of the slow, methodical nature of medieval warfare, in which progress was measured not solely in victories or losses, but in the careful management of logistics, fortifications, and human endurance. For the defenders, daily life was dominated by practical concerns. Soldiers rotated between guarding walls, repairing fortifications, and patrolling the perimeter. Civilians, trapped within the city, labored to maintain food stores, tend livestock if possible, and provide for children and the elderly. Disease, hunger, and fatigue were constant threats, and every minor disruption, whether a damaged gate, a spoiled shipment of grain, or an ill soldier, could have outsized consequences. For observers like Joan d'Arc, who arrived at Orléans in the early summer of 1429, understanding these dynamics was essential for translating her presence into meaningful influence. The English approach to the siege was deliberate. They established fortified positions on surrounding high ground, constructed earthworks, and maintained a network of supply lines to support both soldiers and artillery. Their strategy relied on both intimidation and attrition, cutting off Orléans from reinforcement, slowly wearing down defenders, and using siege engines to batter walls and gates. The slow pace of these operations, often measured in weeks rather than days, demanded patience, careful observation, and adaptive strategy. Mistakes in timing or placement could prolong the siege or expose troops to counterattack, underscoring the practical precision required in medieval military operations. Joan's arrival shifted the psychological and strategic balance. Though she was not formally a commander, her reputation, determination, and perceived divine guidance had an immediate impact on morale. Troops who had grown weary from months of standoff regained energy and focus. Soldiers were inspired not only by the symbolic importance of her mission, but by her practical engagement. She participated in planning, observed weak points in fortifications, and encouraged coordinated action in a measured, disciplined manner. Her presence highlighted the interplay between human psychology and operational effectiveness, a reminder that morale, careful observation, and timing were as critical as physical strength or numbers. The siege also highlighted the grueling daily rhythms of medieval warfare. Defenders rotated shifts on walls, repaired damaged sections of fortification, and managed stores of water and food with meticulous attention. Disease and exhaustion were as dangerous as arrows or cannonballs. Joan, in observing these routines, recognized the importance of sustaining human endurance. She encouraged practical measures, reinforcing key positions, maintaining order in supply depots, and ensuring that soldiers rotated responsibilities to avoid overwork. Her ability to integrate observation with guidance allowed her influence to extend beyond symbolism into tangible operational improvements. English forces, aware of Joan's reputation, adjusted their approach cautiously. Reports of her arrival and the renewed determination of French troops may have caused subtle delays or hesitations in offensive maneuvers. Her presence served as both a rallying point for defenders and a psychological challenge for besiegers. This effect, though difficult to quantify, demonstrates the intricate connections between leadership, perception, and operational effectiveness in medieval campaigns. Within the city, coordination between military and civilian elements was crucial. Civilians helped fortify walls, provide intelligence on enemy movements, and maintain essential services such as bakeries, wells, and infirmaries. Joan's attention to these details reinforced her holistic understanding of the siege. She did not focus exclusively on dramatic moments of combat, but observed and influenced the quieter, mundane operations that were essential to the defenders' survival. In this, her approach mirrored her upbringing in Domrémy, attentive to practicalities, patient in observation, and deliberate in action. The tactical geography of Orléans further complicated operations. The Loire River served as both a natural barrier and a logistical conduit, while surrounding forests and hills provided cover and strategic vantage points. Understanding these features was vital for coordinating attacks and defenses, predicting enemy movements, and ensuring supply routes remained open. Joan's familiarity with the importance of terrain, learned from years of observation in her home region, allowed her to contribute insights that were both practical and immediately applicable. The siege also exemplified the interplay between patience and initiative. Weeks of stalemate could lull defenders into complacency or erode their focus. Joan's approach, combining persistent observation with timely encouragement and guidance, helped maintain discipline and energy. She emphasized incremental gains, repairing sections of walls, reinforcing weak points, timing sorties carefully, which accumulated into meaningful advantages over time. Her understanding of human endurance and organizational dynamics proved as important as any tactical maneuver. Yet even amid these efforts, the outcome was uncertain. English forces remained formidable. Resources within the city were finite, and small errors could have cascading consequences. Joan's role, though significant, required careful balancing. She had to inspire without overextending herself, advise without overstepping formal command, and maintain morale while observing the physical and psychological limits of those under siege. Her effectiveness derived from this disciplined integration of vision, observation, and practical intervention, a pattern that had characterized her development from her earliest days in Domrémy. The Siege of Orléans also provides a window into the human cost of prolonged warfare. Soldiers endured constant stress, civilians faced scarcity and fear, and both were subject to the unpredictable forces of disease, weather, and enemy action. Joan's interventions, though strategic and psychological, were grounded in an acute awareness of these human realities. She recognized that morale, endurance, and practical resource management were inseparable from tactical success, a perspective that underscored the interconnectedness of ordinary life and historical consequence. And yet, even as the city held and preparations for counterattacks progressed, one question remained pressing. Could a small, beleaguered force, buoyed by courage, discipline, and the presence of a single extraordinary figure, overcome the entrenched and methodical English siege? Or would the slow grind of attrition, resource scarcity, and human fatigue ultimately dictate the outcome? By early May 1429, the siege of Orléans had entered its critical phase. For months, the English forces had methodically established fortified positions around the city, cutting off supply lines and attempting to exhaust defenders through attrition. Soldiers and civilians within Orléans were strained. Food and water were carefully rationed, walls and gates continually reinforced, and shifts of guards monitored for any signs of enemy movement. The city was a study in slow, methodical survival, where every action, even the seemingly mundane, could have consequences for life, morale, and the trajectory of the siege. Joan d'Arc arrived at this precarious juncture, her presence immediately altering both perception and momentum. Though she was young and formally untrained in military command, her understanding of human behavior, logistics, and terrain allowed her to contribute effectively. One of her first strategic interventions involved observation of the fortifications themselves. She moved among the battlements and gates, noting weak points in walls, gaps in the rotation of guards, and the locations where defensive firepower could be concentrated most effectively. Her attention to these details, while seemingly minor, allowed commanders to allocate resources more efficiently, reinforcing positions most vulnerable to English assault. Morale was a constant concern. After months of stalemate, soldiers often displayed fatigue, resignation, or hesitation. Joan addressed these issues through a combination of example and direct engagement. She visited the front lines, spoke with individual soldiers, and encouraged collective resolve. Her persistence was both symbolic and practical. Soldiers were reminded that their efforts had purpose, and that the defense of Orléans was integral to the broader goal of supporting Charles VII and reclaiming the kingdom. This dual function of morale, psychological reinforcement, and operational effectiveness was a cornerstone of her influence. Joan also advocated for calculated offensive maneuvers. While the defenders could not engage in full-scale assaults, limited strikes against key fortifications could destabilize the English siege. Using her observations of terrain, timing, and enemy dispositions, she advised on sorties to reclaim strategic positions, reinforce weakened sections of walls, and disrupt supply routes. These small but significant interventions were executed with meticulous attention to risk and timing. Soldiers learned to coordinate around her guidance, balancing the imperative for action with the practical constraints of manpower, armaments, and fatigue. The coordination between soldiers and civilians was equally critical. Civilians worked to repair breaches, transport supplies, and provide information on enemy movements. Joan recognized the importance of integrating these efforts into a coherent strategy. She encouraged communication between guard shifts and supply teams, ensuring that repair work, rationing, and defensive operations did not conflict or leave vulnerabilities. Her interventions highlighted the interconnectedness of all participants in a siege. Success depended not solely on combat prowess, but on the synchronization of diverse, interdependent efforts. One notable example of her influence involved the strategic positioning of artillery and crossbowmen. By observing both the topography and the enemy's likely points of attack, Joan suggested reallocating forces to maximize defensive coverage and effectiveness. Historical records describe her actively participating in the inspection of positions, discussing potential adjustments with officers, and even leading small groups to ensure proper placement and readiness. While she did not make sweeping strategic decisions alone, her input improved coordination, resource utilization, and tactical responsiveness. The human cost of the siege was ever present. Soldiers faced exposure to the elements, repeated stress, and the constant threat of injury or death. Civilians experienced food scarcity, disease, and the psychological strain of prolonged uncertainty. Joan's leadership emphasized both immediate tactical concerns and the longer-term need for endurance. She advised rotations of guards, careful rationing of supplies, and measures to protect the vulnerable. Her approach balanced urgency with sustainability, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of human limits and the slow grind of attritional warfare. The siege also illustrated the subtle interplay between perception and reality in warfare. English commanders were aware of Joan's presence and the renewed determination among French defenders. Reports indicate that her reputation contributed to hesitation and caution among attackers, even without direct engagement. The psychological effect of her perceived divine guidance, combined with practical improvements to defensive operations, amplified the impact of relatively small interventions. Here, once again, the mundane observation, inspection, encouragement, allocation of resources intersected with the extraordinary, producing outcomes greater than the sum of their parts. Joan's focus on practical details extended to the maintenance of weapons, reinforcement of gates, and planning of nightly patrols. Each of these measures, while unremarkable in isolation, contributed to the cohesion and resilience of the defenders. She demonstrated a disciplined approach to problem solving, identifying vulnerabilities, proposing realistic solutions, and ensuring their implementation. This methodical style reflected her lifelong habits of careful observation, incremental planning, and patient adaptation. Perhaps most importantly, Joan maintained a sense of continuity and purpose. While the siege could have easily become a slow, demoralizing trap, she framed each action repairing a wall, repelling a sortie, distributing supplies as part of a larger narrative, the defense of France, and the support of a divinely sanctioned king. This sense of narrative coherence transformed repetitive, exhausting labor into meaningful work, providing soldiers and civilians alike with motivation that was both moral and practical. Yet the siege remained unpredictable. Weather, disease, fatigue, and enemy action could all undermine carefully laid plans. Every day required assessment, adaptation, and vigilance. Joan's interventions, while critical, were not a guarantee of success. They were part of a broader system of preparation, observation, and incremental action that needed to be sustained over time. Her effectiveness depended on both immediate tactical insight and the ability to maintain coherence across extended periods of stress and uncertainty. As the defenders began to implement her guidance and coordinate attacks on English fortifications, one question persisted. Could the combination of careful observation, moral authority, and incremental tactical intervention overcome the entrenched English positions, or would the slow, grinding realities of attrition, fatigue, and logistical strain ultimately dictate the outcome of the siege? By late May 1429, the siege of Orleans had reached a critical turning point. For months, English forces had maintained encirclement, gradually weakening the city's capacity to resist. Soldiers were fatigued, supplies strained, and civilians faced the daily pressures of survival in a besieged urban environment. The siege was a test of endurance as much as strategy, relying on slow attrition, careful management of resources, and the incremental application of force. Joan d'Arc, whose presence had gradually transformed morale, observation, and coordination, now played a pivotal role in turning these elements into decisive action. Her influence manifested in both tactical and psychological ways. Joan actively participated in planning assaults on key fortifications, that had previously resisted French attacks. Her observations of terrain, structural weaknesses, and enemy deployments allowed commanders to target specific positions with precision. She insisted on timing assaults when defenders and attackers could achieve maximum effect, coordinating movements across multiple units to ensure that no part of the operation was left isolated. The careful synchronization of these actions demonstrated her ongoing capacity to merge vision, observation, and practical execution. One particularly critical target was the fortification known as Les Tourelles, a heavily defended position on the southern bank of the Loire. For weeks, it had withstood repeated attempts to dislodge the English garrison. Joan advocated for a focused, coordinated assault, emphasizing timing, morale, and the allocation of resources. Her insistence on careful preparation, checking weapon placements, organizing supporting units, and ensuring coordination among disparate groups proved essential. When the assault finally commenced, French forces, buoyed by her presence and guidance, succeeded in breaching the fortifications, forcing English troops to retreat. This marked a dramatic shift in the siege, signaling that the momentum had shifted toward the defenders. Joan's impact extended beyond the technical success of the assault. Soldiers described her presence as electrifying. She moved among them, offering encouragement, demonstrating fearlessness, and reinforcing the sense of purpose that had gradually replaced exhaustion and doubt. Her ability to maintain composure under direct threat inspired individuals to exceed their typical capacities, transforming routine defensive operations into acts of extraordinary resolve. The combination of strategic insight and moral authority created a multiplier effect, amplifying the effectiveness of French forces beyond what numbers alone would suggest. The aftermath of this victory was both immediate and long-term. The English were forced to lift portions of the siege, allowing supply lines to reopen and communication with Allied territories to resume. Civilians in Orléans, who had endured months of deprivation, regained a sense of security and confidence. Soldiers, previously constrained by fatigue and attrition, experienced renewed energy and determination. The psychological impact of Joan's presence and the successful assaults reinforced the notion that the tide of the war might be turning, demonstrating how leadership, observation, and moral authority could influence events as tangibly as tactical maneuvers. Yet the success at Orléans did not eliminate ongoing challenges. The broader conflict remained unresolved. English and Burgundian forces continued to control other strategic regions. Logistical networks were fragile, and political factions within France still resisted centralized authority. Joan's ongoing task was to ensure that the momentum generated by the victory could be sustained, translating symbolic, psychological, and tactical gains into longer-term strategic advantage. Her role exemplified the careful balance between inspiration and operational planning, showing that even extraordinary acts required disciplined follow-through to produce lasting impact. The Siege of Orléans also highlighted the interconnectedness of ordinary and extraordinary actions. Success depended not only on heroic charges or dramatic interventions, but also on the mundane realities of logistics, rotations of guards, maintenance of fortifications, and the management of human endurance. Joan's attention to these details, combined with her capacity to inspire and coordinate, transformed small, incremental improvements into a decisive outcome. The siege illustrates how history is shaped as much by patient observation, disciplined planning, and attention to human limits, as by dramatic or visible events. In the weeks following the lifting of the siege, Joan continued to participate in campaigns that expanded French control over key territories. Her reputation as a figure of moral and practical authority grew, reinforcing the perception of divine favor and enhancing the willingness of local populations and military leaders to cooperate. These cumulative effects, tactical, psychological, and political, demonstrated the interplay between individual agency and broader structural forces in shaping historical outcomes. And yet, even at this moment of triumph, one question lingered. Could the extraordinary combination of moral authority, disciplined observation, and tactical insight sustain itself across extended campaigns, Or would the pressures of war, politics, and human frailty eventually challenge even the most remarkable efforts? This tension between exceptional individual agency and the slow, grinding realities of history would continue to define Joan d'Arc's extraordinary journey. The lifting of the siege of Orléans in 1429 marked a pivotal turning point in the Hundred Years' War. But the victory was only the beginning of a series of complex, prolonged operations along the Loire River. These campaigns, often overshadowed by the dramatic imagery of Joan d'Arc in armor, were defined by slow-moving logistics, coordination challenges, and the day-to-day endurance of soldiers and civilians. They reveal that the real work of war, especially medieval warfare, depended as much on careful observation, planning, and human perseverance as on singular acts of heroism. Joan, having demonstrated her capacity to influence both morale and operations at Orléans, now faced the broader challenge of sustaining momentum across multiple theatres of conflict. The Loire campaigns involved a chain of towns and fortifications that were strategically vital for controlling the region. Towns such as Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, and Beaugency were not just locations on a map. They were nodes in a network that dictated supply lines, troop movements, and regional allegiance. Control of these points allowed the French forces to secure communication along the Loire, move reinforcements, and challenge English dominance in surrounding territories. Each town presented its own combination of fortifications, garrisons, and local political dynamics, requiring careful planning before any offensive or defensive action could be undertaken. Joan's approach to these operations emphasized observation and coordination. She spent time assessing fortifications, noting weaknesses in walls or gates, observing the disposition of enemy forces, and listening to reports from local informants. Her methodical attention to detail allowed commanders to prioritize targets, allocate forces effectively, and plan the timing of assaults with precision. These observations extended beyond immediate military concerns. Joan also considered the capacity of local populations to withstand occupation or siege, the availability of provisions, and the feasibility of securing towns without incurring excessive casualties or damaging infrastructure. The coordination of forces across multiple towns posed significant logistical challenges. Medieval armies moved slowly, constrained by the need to transport supplies, artillery, and equipment over roads, often damaged by rain or neglect. Horses and wagons required fodder. Soldiers required food and rest, and units needed clear lines of communication to execute complex operations. Joan, though not a formal logistical officer, understood the importance of these practical realities. She advised on the sequencing of troop movements, ensured that supply lines were monitored, and encouraged proactive planning to avoid bottlenecks or delays. Her influence was subtle yet crucial, bridging the gap between strategic vision and operational reality. Morale remained a central concern throughout the campaigns. Soldiers were frequently exhausted from long marches, repeated skirmishes, and exposure to the elements. Civilians in captured towns were often wary or even hostile, adding another layer of complexity to operations. Joan's presence continued to serve as a stabilizing and motivating force. She moved among troops and civilians alike, reinforcing the purpose of their labor, demonstrating composure under pressure, and embodying a disciplined, resolute example. Her capacity to maintain focus and inspire confidence reflected a deep understanding of human behavior, one cultivated over years of careful observation and engagement with the rhythms of ordinary life. One of the significant operations during this phase was the capture of Jargeau. The town was heavily fortified, with English forces entrenched and prepared for defense. Joan advocated for a coordinated assault that emphasized timing, concentrated attacks on vulnerable sections of the walls, and integration of local intelligence on enemy dispositions. The preparation required days of careful reconnaissance, logistical organization, and morale building among troops who had been engaged in continuous operations for weeks. When the assault commenced, the combination of planning, observation, and psychological motivation proved decisive. The French forces successfully captured the town, forcing a retreat by the English garrison. This victory demonstrated the accumulation of small, incremental advantages into tangible outcomes. A hallmark of Joan's approach to military engagement. Meung-sur-Loire and Beaugency followed similar patterns. In each case, Joan's contribution was not simply the symbolic presence of a courageous figure, but the practical influence of careful observation, patient coordination, and attention to human endurance. She ensured that attacks were timed to exploit weaknesses, that troops were prepared both physically and psychologically, and that logistical support was maintained throughout prolonged operations. Even routine tasks repairing siege engines, maintaining supplies, and reinforcing fortifications were coordinated with precision, reflecting her understanding that cumulative, often invisible efforts could determine the success or failure of campaigns. Throughout the Loire campaigns, Joan's influence extended into the administration and management of captured towns. Civilians, essential for maintaining food supplies, labor, and local intelligence, were integrated into the broader operational plan. Joan emphasized cooperation rather than coercion, recognizing that sustaining local support required careful negotiation, clear communication, and attention to ordinary needs. This holistic approach, linking military action, civilian welfare, and strategic objectives, highlighted her capacity to operate across multiple domains simultaneously, balancing immediate tactical demands with longer-term considerations. The campaigns also highlighted the unpredictability inherent in medieval warfare. Weather, terrain, disease, and human error could disrupt even the most carefully prepared plans. Joan's methodical approach relied on continuous observation, incremental adjustments, and the capacity to respond to unforeseen challenges. She maintained vigilance over both the large-scale operations and the small, mundane details that collectively determined outcomes. The rotation of guard shifts, the inspection of fortifications, the allocation of provisions, and the management of troop fatigue. Each of these components, while unremarkable in isolation, contributed to the overarching success of the campaigns. Yet, as the Loire campaigns progressed, one question remained pressing. Could the combination of meticulous planning, human endurance, and moral authority sustain the momentum of successive victories? Or would the slow accumulation of exhaustion, logistical strain, and unpredictable setbacks eventually compromise even the most disciplined efforts? The answer to this question would determine not only the success of the campaigns, but also the trajectory of Joan d'Arc's influence and the broader course of the war.